Everyone, and welcome. I am Suyama Bodhinayaka. As the Chair of Court and the Director of Advocacy and Sustainability at AIA Orange County. It's very encouraging to see all of you join us from around California and the country for this important presentation and discussion. I want to start by thanking our chapter's longtime supporter and platinum sponsor, Collins LLP, and by thanking Shawmut Design and Construction for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Paul Brukop, a longtime AIA Orange County Court member and an attorney at Collins LLP's Orange County office. Paul's practice focuses on construction and professional liability litigation, and he has represented a range of clients, including architects, engineers, general contractors, and public entities. Also joining us today is Sharvil Patel, Director at Shawmut Design and Construction. Sharvil has provided leadership in professional construction services for over 20 years and currently oversees and guides institutional, healthcare, life science projects at Shawmut's New York, Miami, and Chicago offices. In addition to this expertise, he also aspects of all construction process. Sharvil has been an adjunct professor at Pratt Institute and a construction law course advisor at the Brooklyn School of Law. Paul and Sharvil, thank you for being here today. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Suyama, for setting this up. Also, thank you to the AIA folks for getting this all arranged. I also want to say thank you to Sharvil, who agreed to join us and participate in this presentation on relatively short notice, but I think that his contributions are going to be invaluable. So I just want to, there's kind of a lot that we're going to try to cover today, and I'll try to be quick about it, but and relatively succinct. Today we've got 4 learning objectives that we're going to try to convey. Number 1, we're going to want to cover the legal risks of failing to consider climate change beyond code compliance. 2, why a construction professional might resist considering climate change. Ways to address that resistance is going to be the 3rd issue. And 4th, a way, or some suggestions on how architects might be able to advocate for considering climate change in a project. I did want to start off, actually, before I move on to the next slide, just kind of give you some background as to what the genesis of this presentation was. I've been going to COAT meetings for a while now, and at those meetings, one of the things that comes up is how to encourage folks to consider sustainability and consider resilience in their design. And a common theme that would come up is simply that architects, at the end of the day, face some real practical impediments to perhaps taking those concepts into consideration. It might be a resistant client, it might be cost issues, and sort of the thinking is, well, what the client says goes, so that's kind of the end of the story. And it really isn't a full picture of what the story is, and that's what I'm going to be going over today. So first, what are the legal risks? As an attorney, one of the things that I'm always looking out for is for our clients are, how do we avoid litigation? How do we avoid our client from being sued? And it's something that we're hyper focused on. So what's the ultimate consequence that we're looking out for is we're trying to avoid disputes, with from the architect's perspective, with the client and the owner. Other stakeholders might be the contractor, might be other designers who are on the design team. We're trying to avoid lawsuits, right? Actually being sued, named in the lawsuit, and probably more importantly, the cost, the fees, the waste of time that's associated with that. And of course, the main thing we want to avoid is a judgment against our client. right? Where clients are forced to pay out money for some error or omission. And worst case scenario, having risks to their license. You have licensure problems that arise whenever litigation is involved. If there's a judgment, settlement, arbitration award, it's over $5,000, it's got to be reported to the licensing board. So those are some of the issues that as an attorney, we're focused on. Then the question is, well, how does that play into climate change? What's the connection there? What's the risk of a lawsuit? What's the risk of a dispute? And in order to talk about that, I think we got to cover a few concepts. And I think some of these concepts, many of you are going to be very familiar with, particularly if you have any familiarity with code. And there's two general issues, I think, that really come into play when considering climate change. The first is how to design to cope with the effects of climate change. I've often seen this referred to as designing for resilience. The second issue is designing to mitigate climate change or prevent or avoid contributing to climate change, whether it's avoiding CO2 emissions, damage to the environment, or using materials that use a lot of carbon in manufacturing them. And that concept, I think, is generally discussed as in terms of sustainability. So those are two sort of broad, general overarching issues that come up when considering climate change in design. And here I've got a definition that is pulled from the AIA website. It's a good, succinct definition. That resilience is the capacity to adapt to changing conditions, to maintain or regain functionality and vitality in the face of stress or disturbance. So designing to be able to weather the storm. And that's an issue that comes up when considering climate change because of climate volatility. You may have weather events that were previously uncommon are now becoming common. Obviously, the fires in California is something that we're seeing in the news all the time. And sustainable design, here's another definition. It's pulled from the AIA website. And that's to reduce negative impacts on the environment and the health, comfort of building occupants, and as a result, improving building performance. The general objective is you want to reduce consumption of non-renewable resources, minimize waste. You want to create a healthy environment. So you may think, well, there's several statutes, there's building codes that address all of this stuff. Certainly there's building codes that address the safety of a building and how it needs to be constructed in particular environments. There may be other codes you may think of, sort of net zero related codes that are dealing with the sustainability aspect. And you may think, well, why do I have to care beyond that? And really the key concept here and throughout this presentation is the standard of care. The standard of care is really a concept that's broader than the applicable codes. It's a multifaceted and changing concept. And another thing to keep in mind is that often codes are lagging. They're retrospective, or they're addressing an issue that's happened, and 5 years later it becomes codified. So why does the standard of care matter? Well, it certainly matters as an attorney, because when I represent architects, engineers, design professionals, often the reason I'm involved is because our client has unfortunately been named in a professional negligence suit or a cause of action. Somebody has said, you should have done X, you didn't do it, and as a result, we suffered property damage, or in some instances there might be some bodily damage, personal damage. And in those instances, the key concept that comes into play is the standard of care. What should the architect or design professional have done. And here's a definition from what are the California jury instructions. There's a standard set of jury instructions that are available online. And the standard of care is typically thought of as this: an architect is negligent if the architect fails to use the skill and care that a reasonably careful architect would have used in similar circumstances. So it's this level of skill, knowledge, and care that's referred to as the standard of care. Now, what's important to keep in mind here is that we're not just talking about, well, what do the applicable codes say? What are the applicable standards in this particular jurisdiction, this county? It's a broader concept. It's really, what are other architects under similar circumstances doing to address this particular situation, or would they have done? And you may ask, well, then how's a jury going to make that determination? And it's often via expert testimony. So essentially, your peers, other architects, it's an engineer, other engineers saying, well, if I were in this situation, this is what I would have done. As I mentioned before, an important thing to keep in mind is that the standard changes. So what was considered reasonable for an architect 30 years ago probably isn't going to be the same standard of care that's going to be relevant today. It's an evolving benchmark. And importantly, as design professionals become more familiar with concepts of resiliency, sustainability, and start considering climate change in their design, that standard of care is going to evolve too. So, and that's regardless of whether that conduct has actually been codified. So maybe the code hasn't caught up, and that can be for a variety of reasons, right? You may have political reasons, depending on who's in the legislature, or things may take time to get through and pass. But that doesn't mean that the standard of care hasn't evolved to accommodate the current circumstances. So the bottom line is that complying with the building codes and other applicable codified standards is not enough, or at the very least, there's a risk that it may not be enough in the event that you have the unfortunate situation where you may be in a lawsuit. And what comes into play too is foreseeability. And the question is, what's foreseeable? A reasonable person be able to predict or expect the ultimately harmful result of their actions or inactions. So that's going to come into play as well. So going back to a prior example, a weather event that may have been uncommon 30 years ago may be relatively common now, such that it's foreseeable that if you don't take that event into consideration, there's going to be a problem. So let's talk about climate change. I think you all probably generally have a sense of what that means. But here's a decent, succinct definition. It's long-term change in weather patterns that have come to define climates and the broad range of effects caused by these changes. And here's some information about what may be driving some of that, and what some of the considerations are or effects are of climate change. And a lot of this actually really goes to why the building industry really is even considering climate change. The reality is that buildings are consuming 35% of all energy and 60% of generated electricity, a lot of which is fossil fuel generated. In the US, you got about 40% of greenhouse gases as a result of buildings, whether it's construction or the actual operation of the building. And then you get to the effects, which is the rising sea level, extreme weather events. We have the subways flooding every year. I don't know, in New York. But those sorts of things that seem relatively uncommon are starting to become more common and are become part of the consideration in terms of how are we designing, or how are architects designing for those events. I wanted to show you all this because I thought it was an interesting breakdown of the prior stat, the 40% stat that I had mentioned earlier. Building operations are resulting in about 28% of CO2 emissions. So really there's a massive opportunity there to reduce emissions through design, through minimizing energy consumption, and tackling that through certain sustainability strategies. But also the materials portion, I was actually surprised to see that it was this high. And what drives, I think, that percentage is the work that goes into making and transporting a lot of the materials that are used in the construction industry. So overall, there's this 40% CO2 or 40% of CO2 emissions that are coming out of the building industry. So there's a lot of opportunity to really have an impact on the overall CO2 emissions that may be driving climate change. So the AIA has put out plenty of materials on an architect's role in mitigating climate change. The AIA, the International Union of Architects, have recognized a responsibility to the general public and to achieve carbon neutral design by 2030. It's incumbent upon architects to really start shifting their practice to implementing some of these design techniques, whether it's like I'm thinking, we'll talk about this later, but the solar path, right? And reducing materials that use up a bunch of carbon, or in the production process, or using renewable energy in the projects. So what this requires is an architect's active participation and leadership. And part of the reason I bring this up is because you have these initiatives that are broad, they're really, I think, nationwide, that are slowly changing the practice. And I want to bring it back to the standard of care. So what you have is architects who are starting to really implement and strive toward these goals. And that's going to continue changing the standard of care. So here are 4 ways that architects can fight climate change that the AIA has proposed. Join the 2030 commitment to reach net zero new buildings, adapt and retrofit existing buildings. So there's plenty of buildings out there now that weren't designed at all for energy efficiency, and there's a substantial opportunity there. The carbon smart materials, again, as I mentioned earlier, that you see 11% of CO2 emissions being driven by just materials that are being used in construction and manufacturing them or transporting them as well, and pursue renewable energy, solar, and the like. And again, I'm going to highlight this the AIA 2030 commitment because this is a broader initiative that's moving the practice forward. So the architects are implementing these strategies, designing with these commitments in mind, and it's shifting the standard of care. So if one is not paying attention to those shifts, is not adapting to those shifts, there's a growing risk that may not be meeting the standard of care. or at least that there's going to be an argument that the architect is not meeting the standard of care. So I'm bringing up zero net energy here, and this goal to reach zero net energy by 2030. Again, this is another factor that's going to be driving the profession and changing that standard. And as recently as this year, you had an assembly bill that's now requiring architects to do 5 hours of coursework regarding zero net carbon design. What's that going to do? What that's going to do likely is mean that architects are going to be thinking about zero net carbon and are going to be more familiar with these concepts and are going to be likely thinking ahead of where the code is or applicable building codes are, such that, again, that standard of care starts shifting toward sustainability, toward resilience, and then it's incumbent upon other architects to keep up with that. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the AIA has developed rules and ethical standards that directly deal with sustainability issues. One thing I do want to note actually is if you go to the 2020 Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, there's a little blurb that says this should not be used as a standard of care against architects. And that may be the case. And I think there's also instances in case law where courts have refused to use a broad proclamation of an ethical standard against an architect. But what it does give you insight into is where the profession is going and what may be driving other architects and the goals that they're striving for. And as a result, again, changing the standard of care. So let's take a look at Ethical Standard 2.4. It says members should make reasonable efforts to advise their clients and employers of their obligation to the environment, including access to clean air, water, sunlight, energy for all, sustainable production, extraction, transportation, and consumption practices. So, here, encouraging architects to take these concepts into consideration in their design and talking to clients. Rule 2.401 is interesting as well because it requires an architect to inform their clients about their potential environmental impacts or the potential environmental impacts of the project or the product on the environment. And 6.1 again goes back to the general trend of setting ambitious performance goals for greenhouse gas emissions with their clients for each project. So, is everybody going to be following these or really striving for them? No, probably not. Are a good number of people going to be trying? Likely, and it may vary by region. And as a general matter, again, really my point is you're going to have to pay attention to it one way or the other, whether it's codified or not. So the ethical standards go through a variety of other issues too: water use, building materials, ecosystems, and we already covered a similar rule, 6.501. But again, this is all driving the profession toward a more sustainable or a practice that pays attention to sustainability. So the sun path movement, again, many of you may be familiar with this. It's essentially paying attention to where the sun is and how it interacts with the site and how it's going to interact with the project. It's this kind of thing that I think is relatively straightforward for design professionals to implement, and it's a straightforward concept, I think, for clients to understand, and it's something that's being actually implemented. So this is an example of kind of where things are going. And if somebody's not paying attention, they're not really getting a full assessment of where the standard of care currently lies. Now, as an attorney, we pay attention to risks, and we also pay attention to how to minimize risks. So here are some strategies on how to minimize risk when designing for climate change. I'd say number one, and I'll probably say this 6 more times, is clear and consistent communication with your client. As climate considerations come up, talk to your client about them. Talk about the issues that you're worried about. I think this comes up particularly in the resiliency concept. If you're thinking about weather events, that kind of thing, you're anticipating them, it makes sense to talk to the client about it. The opportunity for this is obviously at the initial stages when you're really talking to the client, trying to understand what the expectations are. But that's also an opportunity for an architect to communicate those concerns or ideas that the owner may or may not take into consideration, but at least there's been a conversation about it. And this next point, it's going to really depend, I think, on the developer or the client that you're working with. But to the extent you have knowledge about a particular expert or a consultant, it's good to have that conversation with the client then too, and recommend folks who may be able to address certain sustainability or resiliency goals. And after you've had those conversations, then you can talk about how to present it to, or you can formulate a way to present it to the client. One thing also that I'd like to emphasize in addition to clear and consistent communication with the client is documenting that advice, documenting those discussions. From my perspective, my concern is that an architect, design professional may have a client who just doesn't care, do what you got to do, deal with the building code. That's all we need. And they think, okay, well, that's what the client wants. We're just not going to take these other things into consideration. Just because that client doesn't care then doesn't mean that they're not going to care when the event that may have been reasonably foreseeable actually occurs. Whether it's flooding on the first floor because of a unexpected or now expected rain event, or sea level rise, that kind of thing. It's interesting how quickly a client can go from not caring about something to saying, hey, well, you're the professional, you're the one who should have told me about it. So how do you address this in contracts? You're going to document the scope of the project, including sustainability efforts that are to be taken, considered. One thing that I'd warn against is you don't want to promise specific results. You don't want to, particularly kind of given what we've discussed, which is that climate change in some ways can just be described as climate volatility in many respects. So what may be predictable for the next 5-10 years may not be predictable beyond that. Include exclusions, and by that I think that goes hand in hand with my prior discussion about documenting conversations. To the extent that a client doesn't want to consider something, you may want to exclude that from the contract. And again, if you have recommendations for consultants, experts, you can make those recommendations at the contracting phase. So, as I mentioned at the outset, our concern as attorneys is we're paying attention to litigation. We don't want our clients in court. We don't want them being sued. Sometimes it's not even a lawsuit. You have pre-litigation claims that can be costly. You've got mediators. It's a waste of time. And some cases really start to shed light on what design professionals may be facing in the future. Overall, I'd say litigation dealing with climate change hasn't really been focused on design professionals. That said, I'll tell you, don't underestimate a plaintiff attorney's creativity or willingness to kind of go out on a limb. And also don't underestimate the possibility that a lawsuit might actually stick. So we're going to go through a few examples, some hypothetical, some actual, of where the litigation might be leading. So you have a situation here where the school district's in a high desert area. There's roof damage due to high winds. The design allegation is going to be that, well, the architect should have designed for wind barriers and should have specified materials that are appropriate for high winds. Design defense, well, if other folks in the area are designing for that, well, it's going to not, you're not going to have a very strong defense. This Pietroangelo case was a situation where a plaintiff sued a car repair shop for flood damage to the car. It really wasn't about a design professional, but the interesting concept that was raised here was that the court started to acknowledge that, hey, maybe an act of nature defense doesn't really fly in a world that's being affected by climate change. Again, this goes to foreseeability. You know, what may have previously been an unforeseeable fire now has become commonplace. Hurricane Harvey lawsuit. Over 400 residential owners sued an engineering firm due to flooding as a result of Hurricane Harvey. They allege that the engineer designed the stormwater management system negligently. You know, this is the kind of thing that may become more of an issue for architects, engineers, who, in short, folks, the requirement may be you need to be thinking ahead for these seemingly rare weather events that are becoming more common. So here's a hypothetical scenario that I think is, well, it's actually based on one of my clients, which is that loosely, which is you've got a design team designing homes along the coast and they decide to use a mat slab foundation. Some other homes use caissons. You have a situation where there's storm flood damage and that damages the foundation. The allegation is going to be from the owner is going to be, well, the architect and the design team fell below the standard of care. Why didn't you use the caissons? Look at that house, and that house. That client, that plaintiff is going to hire an expert. Again, it's going to be one of your peers. It's going to be an architect who's generally practicing in the same area, and who's going to say, well, yeah, in that instance, in that area, we definitely would have used caissons. Now, was it codified? It got through plan check. Was it required to use the caissons? In this instance, maybe not, but that doesn't mean that the standard of care isn't above that. So this is really, you know, the question is, why is there some resistance? And I don't think that some of these reasons are that unfamiliar. I mean, cost. I think probably a lot of times it's cost with even thinking about how to design for sustainability or resilience. Maybe sometimes being unfamiliar with the value of an alternative, that in fact maybe a more sustainable product might actually be more cost effective or cost effective in the long run. There may be marketing value to the final product, prestige, you know, whether you've got certifications that might make the property more sellable. Time, and the reality is, I think the process of designing for climate change is a collaborative one that's going to be involving, you know, owner, the general contractor, and the architect, and it may take time, and you may have a client who's got a time crunch and doesn't want to take the time to think about climate change. And I highlighted here in red incomplete risk assessment of failing to consider climate change issues. And this really goes to pretty much the entire presentation, which is, I think that there's perhaps a failure to really understand that if you don't consider the climate change issues now, they may come back to haunt you 2, 3, 5 years from now, when you're faced with, for instance, an event that's driven by climate change. So how do you address that resistance? We talked about talking to the client. You got to have the conversation about considering climate change and really the risks that you're considering. And I think through that conversation, you start to get an understanding of what the specific basis is for a particular client. Again, time, cost, unfamiliarity with the process. And that's really going to guide how to address the resistance. You're going to have to be making a business case. What's the bottom line? How is it affecting the bottom line? Have to talk about issues like return on investment or marketability factors. And then how are you going to advocate for considering climate change? I think the opportunity really is at the contracting stage. The AIA has got form documents. There's the AIA B101, 2017 version. That's the owner architect agreement. And it's got provisions that are directly addressing sustainability and really encouraging an owner and architect to have those discussions early on. There's an add-on to that, which is the E204, the 2017 version, which sets out a really comprehensive process for discussing sustainability. Again, that involves the owner, architect, and contractor, which is probably the way that it needs to be. One suggestion is a climate change issue doesn't really have to be presented as one. If there's a cost benefit to a solution that happens to align with a sustainability or resiliency goal, then it doesn't need to be presented as, hey, here's something that aligns with sustainability goals. It's a cost benefit. Likewise, a return on investment or just making the business case, it can simply be presented as a business case. And I'm going to highlight again discussions throughout the project with the client. I think that there may be folks may have an initial discussion about climate change issues, that conversation may end once it's clear that a client may be resistant to those concepts for whatever reason. But that doesn't mean that that conversation can't continue happening, and especially if new issues come to mind or factors change. So, for instance, you may have a rain event, or maybe considering the lack of water, and you can, through the course of the project, those conditions may change that may give an opportunity to discuss sustainability issues, climate change issues, again with the client. So I want to move on to actually having a conversation with Sharvil. He works for Shamit, and I thought it would be helpful actually to have a non-architect be part of this discussion, just so we could get another perspective and see what some of the considerations are from the contractor, the builder side. Much of what I've been talking about obviously has been what are the risks and the considerations that an architect needs to keep in mind for themselves, really, to avoid litigation, to avoid disputes, that kind of thing. But I think Sharvil may have some really good insights and input. Sharvil, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's really these questions that I posed to you, and if you could speak on them, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, no problem, Paul. So Siam and I worked on a project a little over 10 years ago. And that was, I think, my first exposure to climate change related impacts to a project during Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast and in New York. We were building a school in Long Island City, right on the waterfront, block away from the ferry stop. And the first floor flooded. So we had to replace a bunch of elevator components, rip out some finishes, that sort of stuff. And Hurricane Sandy in the East Coast precipitated quite a few local code changes, from resiliency standards to updating of flood maps, and that was a response to an event. And I think a lot of what Paul has said already is that we're potentially stuck in an approach of responding to an event as opposed to preventing an event. And this is how people are wired. Agencies, municipalities are wired, the government. So market-related changes are, a better opportunity to create change and be at the forefront of change. And in preparation for this, I think I had mentioned that the West Coast is just way further ahead than the East Coast when it comes to being at the forefront of addressing climate change and sustainability issues. What we are looking at is making the case from a business perspective while being considerate of architecture, which is an art form, and construction, which is a skilled craft, right? And when doing, how do you kind of bring in those things? How do you bring in how do you merge art and or create practical art, I'm going to say. And that kind of does happen through the business terms where you have a vision that's mindful, and then you're able to kind of speak to that vision in the same vocabulary as someone who may not be looking at it that way and is viewing it through a different lens. So we talked about return on investment. We talked about protecting an investment like that school in Long Island City. If we were to build it today, none of the mechanical rooms would be on the ground floor per code. So that's a simple thing that has that can be thought of now in advance with minimal to no cost impact on a project. And the other aspects are, hey, if you're in a flood zone, does your design allow for a reduced insurance risk? And how are you making that case to the end user, not the end user, excuse me, the property owner, the building owner? And I do think that while this conversation is focused around the designer's responsibility and current approach, I also think that on the construction side, we're also kind of following, right? And there isn't a lot of partnership at the front end between designer and contractor to address the issues that we're talking about in many delivery methods, certainly stipulated sum and your traditional GMP. Insofar as design build and IPD, I think those lend themselves to that partnership much earlier. And again, that's another area where the West Coast is a little bit ahead of us on the East Coast. So we also look at something that Paul mentioned in terms of prestige, right? So in the late 2000s, mid 2000s, the USGBC came out with the LEED standard. LEED is on its way out. We had LEED, we have WELL. Now we have Living Building Challenge, and those standards are going to evolve. The question is, well, do we want to follow the standards, or do we want to market the standards, or is it some sort of in between? Not everyone wants to have a plaque on their building. Not everyone wants to go through the trouble of getting that sort of paperwork done, but their values may speak to building to those standards. So some strategies that we have used, that I just mentioned, is kind of saying, well, your end users are going to want a healthy building, and if you're going to be marketable in a competitive environment, and I'm confident that the competitive environment of office space will be back inevitably. And you'll also have, residences, which will have, if we don't have offices anytime soon, people who are buying homes, condos are going to want the same things. And so market demand is going to be there. And if you're trying to address a market demand in terms of vocabulary, there may be an opportunity for more success.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually wanted to follow up on one of the points that you had made, which is the lack of collaboration at the outset. Have you had a instance or an example where you have had that collaboration at the outset and has been successful?
Sure. And it kind of goes back to that delivery method, right? So where we've had that opportunity has been on design build and IPD projects in the New England region. So Shamit does a fair bit of institutional work up there, higher education, and we've been doing IPD with Brown for at least 7, if not 10 years plus. And when you're there as a partner with the architect, with the client, those sorts of discussions can happen so much further in advance, right? So before you're putting pen to paper, or when you're just brainstorming of what the programmatic needs are, creating massing models, et cetera, the earlier in that curve you can get to addressing sustainability, the more impactful your decisions can be in maintaining a certain cost threshold. So, I think that's where we've seen the success. When STIP sum is just, give us a project. We don't want you to think, right?
Right.
You're not here to think, you're here to build.
Right. So I'm curious, have you ever had an instance in a STIP sum context where you've had a successful incorporation of design climate issues in the design, or climate change considerations?
I don't think that there were any, in my experience, actively pursued conversations that led to sustainable construction materials, et cetera. There are market forces that have been in play for well over a decade that have allowed for easier access to sustainable materials and practices, so that we've achieved over the last 10, 15 years, and will continue to do so, a new threshold of what's considered a minimum, right? Just most of your conversation, Paul, was what is the new minimum?
Right.
And similarly, design and construction have established minimum thresholds for how to build, and spec writer, zero VOC paint. What project do you see these days that has non-zero VOC paint outside of an industrial application, right? Same thing, and like adhesives for flooring materials, same thing. That's the new minimum. Now it's like really time to think about, how do we go beyond that? How do we go beyond responding to an event to mitigating an event?
Right. Agreed. And it sounds like you guys you're seeing the same kind of thing, which is the standard of care, at least for builders, is shifting. So just to recap, again, really the focus, and I probably said ad nauseum now, is that standard of care is shifting. It's worth paying attention to sustainability and resilience, and considering climate change, because of that more amorphous standard of care concept that is being driven by other professionals who may actually be taking those issues very seriously.
Paul and Sharvil, sorry to interrupt. We have some questions from the public.
Sure, yeah.
There are 3 questions so far. So Kira asked, has Paul heard of any architects being sued for failing to abide by AIA's Code of Ethics, especially around environmental responsiveness or climate concerns?
So the answer to that is no, I haven't. I think I mentioned during the presentation, I think there may even be a case, not in California. I think it's out. I'll maybe the jurisdiction will come to me. I believe it's out of California where they tried to. They said, you know, look, this is what the ethical standard is, and I believe that the expert wanted to testify to the ethical standards that the AIA published, and the judge said that it was going to be too prejudicial. Now that said, the way I think that ethical standard can play into the standard of care analysis is that ethical standard will leak into the profession, right? It will sort of over time, it will make its way into the population of professionals, and that's really, I think, where you start seeing the potential liability, because then, you know, whether an expert says, then an expert may not be able to say, hey, the AIA says this is the ethical standard, but they may be able to say, well, all the architects in my area do that.
Right. Okay. Second question, Paul, for you again. Has Paul heard of architects being sued to failure to advise clients of climate impact on a building? Example, Superstorm Sandy, Ida, etc.
Yeah. So, you know, the example that I used with the caissons and the mat slab foundation was all kind of like that. What you had was a bunch of developments that were on the coast, and if you've ever developed on the coast, you'll know that there's a ton of regulation, a ton of you know, you become close friends, or maybe, I don't know, maybe enemies with plan check. There's a lot of back and forth, and in that instance, it was a client who I think was really cost driven and said, no, like I want whatever's cheapest. There was a change in jurisdiction. The jurisdiction took a more stringent perspective of like what the potential effects of climate change might be, and as it caused a whole bunch of delay on the project. So that architect in particular wasn't sued for instance, a flood that damaged the property, right, and failure to consider that flood, but it was more along the lines of you, architect, failed to consider that this was a possible, I suppose, change or standard change, and that caused a bunch of delay on the project. I'm suing you for delays. I'll be happy to say that we got the client out of that, and they ended up getting paid. So, you know, the viability of that kind of theory against an architect, you know, maybe it's a little bit specious now, but it's not too far off from the catastrophic weather event sort of scenario.
The last question, I think, is from Guy. Who, how would one attribute proportion of damage from an event in terms of not meeting sustainability goals? I think that was,
maybe I can look. I may have missed part of it.
yeah.
Is it in the chat?
It's on the chat, and I think Adam kind of gave a response to that with a course that's happening later in the year on FEMA Building Science branch.
How would one attribute proportion of damage for an event in terms of not meeting sustainability goals? Yeah, you know, yeah, that's I would say, a very, very complicated question that's going to really depend on the circumstances of a particular case. I suppose in that instance, it depends also like what goals you're talking about. I guess I think of this as more of a resilience sort of issue. So if there's a weather event, you know, we keep talking about rain, but you know, the inverse of that would be the lack of water and how that might affect a site. How would liability be apportioned? I mean, it's going to depend on what the problem is. So for instance, if you're talking about a foundation system, right? you're probably going to be dealing with an architect and a structural, maybe a geotech as well. And depending on what the contractual relation is vis-a-vis the architect, that liability may be apportioned very differently. So I would like to give you a more concrete answer than just it depends. But in this instance, it really would depend on the factual situation.
I mean, I'll put my email on the chat if anyone has follow-up questions or comments or suggestions. Please send me an email and I will make sure that I transfer it on to Paul or Sharvil.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Well, I would like to thank Paul and Sharvil for that compelling presentation and discussion. We're almost at time. Your expertise and perspective today is a reminder of the key partnerships that are needed to advance and achieve sustainable built environment. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you for joining AIA Orange County Court.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Siyama. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Sharvil.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharvil. Thanks, Paul.